Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a special Zoom town hall recorded on December 15th, marking the anniversary of the Bill of Rights. The Thomas Jefferson Hour was created by Clay Jenkinson, the award-winning humanities scholar and author. I'm your host, David Swenson, and we are joined this week by Beth Kaler, acting as moderator for the discussion.
Let me start by saying this. First, welcome. Today is the anniversary of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution. Jefferson played a role. When Jefferson got copies of the Constitution in Paris in the later autumn of 1787, he read the document with great interest. He said that the people who had done it were 55 demigods, and that undoubtedly they had produced something of extraordinary importance. But when he saw that there was no Bill of Rights, Jefferson was really not only disappointed, but upset. And he wrote a famous letter to his closest friend and protege, James Madison, in which he said, "What every people on earth has a right to expect against its government is a Bill of Rights. This can never be left to inference." And he pushed hard for Madison to either have another convention or to add a Bill of Rights. Madison was not convinced. Madison believed that the state bills of rights were adequate. And he also said to Jefferson that a Bill of Rights is, quote, a parchment guarantee. In other words, nice rhetoric, but so what? It's hard to enforce it. And Jefferson was not convinced by that argument. He said a Bill of Rights is essential to any constitution in the age of the Enlightenment. And so then Madison got himself elected to the first Congress of the United States, a delegate from Virginia. And he then gathered some 88 proposed amendments from all over the country, some of them frivolous, some of them extraordinary, some of them that would have undone the Constitution. So he had to be very careful about those. And he then whittled them down to about 18 and eventually submitted about a dozen to the Congress of the United States. And the first Congress of the United States debated them briefly, but not exhaustively by any means, because even the first Congress regarded the Bill of Rights as a bit of a public relations afterthought. And then when they had debated them sufficiently for about 10 days, 12 of the amendments were promulgated. As you know, amendments have to pass 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify them. So they went to the states, and on December 15th, 229 years ago today, Virginia became the state that took the amendments over the hump, and they became official parts of the Constitution of the United States. So for Jefferson, this was a great triumph. And for us, it's an enormous triumph, because imagine just for a moment, imagine the history of this country without the Bill of Rights. The Constitution is a very fine document, but the Bill of Rights is a much more Jeffersonian document and a much more important document. Just take, for example, the Fifth Amendment. If you're accused of a crime and brought into court and someone asks you to essentially confess on the witness stand or to describe the trial or the crime, you can say, "I plead the Fifth Amendment. I am protected by the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States from self-incrimination." People that probably couldn't recite that amendment know what the Fifth is. They know what the First Amendment protects: freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the right to petition, the right for people to assemble. And so the Second Amendment, of course, the right to keep and bear arms. And so these amendments are of absolutely critical importance to the history of human freedom. And the 14th Amendment, which followed the Civil War, nationalized them. Up till then, the Bill of Rights only applied to national government events. But after that, with the 14th Amendment, they percolated down into the states and local jurisdictions. So that's one reason that we meet today on the 229th birthday of the Bill of Rights. And another reason is that we're one day after the Electoral College vote yesterday. There's a lot of uncertainty this year, as you know, and there was some concern that there would be faithless electors, or that some states would put up an alternative set of electors and so on and so forth. It turns out that the Electoral College voted reliably in the way that was expected, and therefore yesterday the election was decided by the mechanism in the U.S. Constitution that the electors will send in their votes. There's one more bit of this, as you know, and that's in early January. The House and Senate meet, to accept the electoral vote, and the vice president will open the tallies and report the winner, and then both houses of Congress need to affirm that. It has been a rubber stamp procedure through almost the entirety of American history. This year, it takes on a slightly more weighty significance, because there is some talk that there will be challenges which are possible under our system by members of the House of Representatives to the tally from their individual states. So we'll see. But yesterday was an extremely important day. First, there was the election, and then there was the certification in the 50 states, and then there was the safe harbor day, which was December 8th, and now yesterday, December 14th, the electors performed as was expected, and Joe Biden was declared the 46th president of the United States. So, David, an important day.
Yes, sir, and noted. Before we begin the questioning in this week's program, I would just like to take a moment and recognize Beth Kaler, who is a fairly new addition to the Thomas Jefferson Hour family, and it is she who did all the legwork and organization for this town hall, this Zoom town hall, and she'll be acting as moderator. And I just want to say thank you for all you've done already, Beth, and welcome.
You are too gracious. Thanks, David. So with that,
please don't be shy. Who has the first question?
I would look to Michael Stein.
Hello, thank you very much for having this, Clay. My question is, the First Amendment guarantees the right to freedom of speech, but with the advent of Facebook and YouTube and all of these other social media platforms, an individual person can reach potentially millions of people across the United States or the world. But it also allows people who are doing things maliciously to subvert elections or to gather people together and spread disinformation throughout the population. So what would Jefferson's view on this be? Does there need to be another constitutional amendment to regulate how these social media platforms work to eliminate all of the nefarious activities that take place?
Thanks for that question. It's an important one. I just finished teaching a course on the U.S. Constitution that was actually extremely interesting and popular, and we're going to do it again. Beth Kaler and I are going to schedule it again for the end of January and through February. And so it turned out to be way more significant than we could have predicted. Of course, we're in the midst of this great constitutional crisis in America, but we had a person the other day who said, along the lines of your question, Michael, that he was a student of Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan, the Canadian intellectual, wrote a famous book called The Medium is the Message. He said that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written in the age of Gutenberg. They were written in the age of the hand press. And Franklin was a printer, and you had to actually set each letter in each sentence. Each page was brought down. You had to ink the page each time. It was very cumbersome and slow moving, but it was a miracle technology at the time. And so he said that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written for that technology. And then came radio, or the telegraph perhaps, and that changed the discourse. And then came television, and then came cable television, and 24/7, 365, silo cable, and now the internet. And his view was that Constitution that was written in 1787 doesn't have the capacity to coordinate and regulate the age of the internet, the age of social media, that we're sort of in unprecedented waters here. And maybe we need to either amend the Constitution in the way that you suggest, or start over in some way. So, I'm not sure quite what I believe about that, but I can tell you this one little piece of history, that when Jefferson was born, there were 3 newspapers in the United States. By the time he died, there were hundreds, mostly weeklies. And when the Republicans, Jefferson's party, took the country over in 1800 in what Jefferson called the Second American Revolution, one of their tools was the press. So up till then, most presses had been controlled by wealthy entities, the Federalists, the Federalist side. But suddenly Jefferson and his people, like Madison, realized that the press was becoming less expensive to obtain, and that anyone could create a press. And so it was a bit like social media today, and they used it. They used the press to get the word out, and the Federalists were shocked by this insurgency, by the proliferation of inexpensive presses, and they were offended by it, and they thought that there's something wrong about mere citizens having access to the means of dissemination. And so you see that these questions sort of are perennial questions. Who figures it out first? It's thought in our time that Barack Obama is the first to really figure out how to win an election by way of social media, and now everyone is on board with that. And you have to, whatever you think of Donald Trump, you have to give him credit that he realized that Twitter was an enormously potent tool that he could use to avoid going through major media, to avoid being filtered in any way, to speak directly to millions and millions and millions of Americans. And so I give him credit for that, because the people who understand emerging technologies are often able to use them to their political or social or economic advantage. So it's not clear where we're headed, Michael. I don't know. My own view is an optimistic one. I'm a Jeffersonian to the core. And so I think that we're watching the birth pangs of the social media world, and it's a little chaotic. There's a lot of silliness, and there are a lot of cat memes, and people post pictures of their foot surgeries, and there's a lot of viciousness and anger and vitriol and ad hominem and maliciousness, and I think these are all signs of an emerging technology where people are getting a kind of a full of themselves because they can post something. They can post something through a pseudonym, and they can say what they want for the first time. And there's no intermediary. There's no editor at the local newspaper to say, oh, Fred, you can't talk that way, or Judy, that's way in excess of what we can print here. And so everyone has direct access to whoever will listen. So I think I'm cheerful about it. I think that this will play itself out. But in the short term, it's produced a lot of, I think, political chaos. And I'll close by just saying I was editing today an interview that I did with David French, who lives in Tennessee, and he's written a book called Divided We Fall, about the coming Brexit movements in the United States. And his view, too, is that the internet has exacerbated the silo problem of people only listening to that which they want to hear and not in any way attending to that which they no longer respect or wish to hear. So I think we're in for a pretty wild ride.
You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a Zoom town hall recorded on December 15th. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, our Zoom town hall recognizing the 229th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. This town hall gave listeners of the Thomas Jefferson Hour an opportunity to question Clay Jenkinson directly.
Look to Paul next. Paul?
So let me ask first, am I addressing Mr. Jenkinson or Mr. Jefferson?
Jefferson couldn't come. He's just so shy, and he's afraid of strangers. But I can channel him.
In the century since the Bill of Rights was adopted, much of the nation's economy has shifted from Jefferson's agrarian Republican ideal to an economy dominated by vast corporations, what Jefferson and Madison mutually derided as monopolies. In the late 19th century, the Supreme Court asserted that those legal constructions can enjoy all the rights and protections guaranteed in the Constitution. Corporations, we are told by some legal authorities, are people. In your view, Mr. Jefferson or Mr. Jenkinson, is this a proper interpretation? Should these modern, borderless nation-state monopolies be afforded the same rights and privileges as natural persons who put their bare hands in the earth?
This is a real problem. And if you remember from our discussions in the Constitution course, the 14th Amendment was perverted, was deliberately distorted by the courts after it was ratified, and it was used to protect corporations, but deliberately prevented from protecting the people that it was intended to protect. So the 14th Amendment was intended to protect freed slaves and African Americans, and instead it was used to create the legal fiction that a corporation is a person, and then it protected them while systematically destroying or undermining the rights of freed slaves and African Americans. And so it's one of the great perversions of intention in the course of American history. And that precedent, you know how important precedent is in court rulings, that continues to this day. And you see it again with Citizens United. You know, Citizens United is the court case that essentially allows unlimited money in political campaigns. And the court said that it's a free speech issue. And so I think the answer to this is, I'm sorry to say, that in a capitalist society like ours, money finds a way. Every time we see reform legislation to try to limit the capacity of money in our elections, the wealthiest people of the culture find a way around it, find a way to overturn it, find a way to bribe their way through it. And there has been no actual success in preventing what Hamilton called the wise, the rich, and the well-born from mostly controlling the discourse of the country. And I expect that will continue no matter what we do. So it's a bad situation. But Jefferson would clearly be against the idea that a corporation is a person. He wasn't fond of the idea of a corporation anyway, although they were just getting started. And his view was that constitutions and bills of rights are about the rights of individuals, the rights of people, the rights of actual human beings, and that should be the focus. So I want to ask Pat a question, though, because Pat Brodowski has been such a friend of ours, because Paul began by talking about the agrarian. I've been writing about this in my book on North Dakota that will be out in May. And I've also been reading Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a terrific book. And it talks quite a bit about Charlottesville and about Virginia. You've been gardening for a long time, and you have capacities as an agrarian that I envy and David Swenson envies. What have we lost in losing Jefferson's agrarian base to our democracy?
That's a great question. We have lost touch with actually the food that feeds us, the people that make the food, all of the people with that invest themselves in actually providing for everyone else. That's really frustrating to me. A lot of people don't realize how much effort it takes to produce anything that we consume, and they're just consumers.
When I first went to Monticello 30 years ago, the gardens were in neglect, let's say. And then Peter Hatch came around and really gave emphasis to the gardens. You've been the gardener now for a number of years. People are fascinated by the agrarian. They flock down to that terrace. I mean, they want to see you and your interns and other staff members with their hands in the soil. And people actually ask you if they can put their hands in the soil. What do you think that's about?
I know there's a lot of people like that. A lot of people who want to do traditional arts because they can see the immediate result. It's a tangible feeling, and like when you put your hands in the soil, you can feel the warmth or whatever. And you can watch the change happen, and you have some minor control over what happens. And then you can become skillful at those small changes. Whereas a lot of the stuff people do today it's really cerebral and group networking and all that kind of thing. It has no place in a garden or turning a piece of wood or making a chair. Group networking isn't part of that at all. It's whether you are doing the right, true thing at that moment for that, between you and that item that you're doing.
What a great insight. Thanks so much for calling in, Pat. Always good to hear from you.
Next is Andy Cohen in Virginia Beach.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question about the Second Amendment, particularly the preamble to it, which our Supreme Court for the last few decades has decided is superfluous. So the first question is what did the framers intend by that preamble? And in particular, when I was going back and reading through the Bill of Rights, I think the Second Amendment is the only one of the Bill of Rights that has such a preamble that states its purpose before it states the right. And so I'm curious if there's a significance for why the framers felt that preamble was necessary for the Second Amendment, but not for others.
Complicated question. Let me give the briefest answer that I can. So in the Constitution course that I was teaching and will be teaching again, we talked about original intent and what the framers had in mind and so on. And one of the conclusions we came to is that there is the hard C Constitution with a capital C, the one that talks about how a president can veto a bill and how both houses of Congress can override the veto and when the Electoral College meets and so on. That's the hard C Constitution, and we all are aware of it. Then there's the small c Constitution of norms. For example, the president's cabinet is not in the Constitution. Executive privilege is not in the Constitution. Judicial review is not in the Constitution. Executive orders are not in the Constitution. There's a lot that we do That's small c constitution. It's more like the British Constitution. It's a set of traditions that have burbled up over time, and now they have really sacred status in the United States. Then there's the third constitution, which is the way we constitute ourselves. That's the way we behave as a society, and that sometimes has a legal potency and sometimes not. So if you take the Second Amendment, just ask yourself this: if we use that thing in the Men in Black movie, that Huji where you push the button and people's minds go blank, and we had 55 founders today to make a new constitution, do you think that they would have the Second Amendment in it the way that amendment is in the Constitution? The answer is of course not, because that Constitution was written for a 3-mile-per-hour world in which a musket took 35 or 40 seconds to reload. And so things have changed. But the Second Amendment probably was intended to prevent a standing army or a permanent military establishment. And that's what the opening clause is about. A well-regulated militia being desirable, the people shall have the right to bear the arms to participate in that militia. So the militias are gone. And so you could argue that from a hard C constitutional standpoint, the Second Amendment has changed and maybe run its course. But the small c Constitution regards the Second Amendment as an absolute guarantee that you and I can have weapons and that nobody has a right to do much regulation of them. And to try to get at that small c constitutional attitude, which has, by the way, been confirmed by lots of court cases in the 20th century, would be exceedingly difficult. And so if you brought Madison into a national conference of the NRA, and if it had a Zoom element so that every NRA member in the world could watch it, and Madison said, folks, I didn't intend you to have AR-15s and 9mm handguns and bump stocks and so on, he'd be booed off the stage. He would be called a fake founding father. He'd be called alternative founding father. So this is deeply now embedded in the American consciousness, and getting at it in any way would be almost impossible. But I can assure you that from a purely historical point of view, if you brought Madison and Washington and Franklin and Roger Sherman and the rest into the room and said, what did you intend by the Second Amendment? They would not say that anyone who wants one can have a small arsenal and that government has no capacity to regulate that in any way. There would be some absolutists, and Jefferson actually would be more on the absolutist side than the others. Jefferson would probably say you need a gun in case you need to bring down your government from time to time. But Jefferson always was something of a radical in that respect. So it's really important when we have these conversations for us to remember the three constitutions: the hard C constitution, the small c constitution, and then the way we constitute ourselves. And if you keep them in mind, it takes a lot of frustration out of these conversations. You really realize the layeredness of our system.
I have a question from the chat room from Rob Barron, wanting to know if there are any influences from antiquities that found their way into our Bill of Rights.
Yes, the founding fathers were all big students of the classical world. They read Livy, and they read Tacitus, and they read Polybius, and they read some of Aristotle, and they certainly read Plutarch, and Plutarch's lives were written in Greek, but the lives of the eminent Romans and Greeks, these were parallel lives, one Greek, one Roman. They included people like Solon and Lycurgus and Demosthenes from Greek civilization, and then people like Cicero and Crassus and Pompey and Caesar and Cato and so on from Rome. And these were almost the textbook of the founding fathers. They all were looking at this, trying to shape American behavior and their own personal behavior by way of these biographical epitomes that were written by Plutarch 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago. And George Washington, for example, presented himself as the American Cincinnatus. He was like the Roman Cincinnatus who reluctantly saved Rome and then went back to live under his vine and his fig tree. So the founding fathers were really deeply immersed in this. But the ancient Romans were not much on rights. They were much more on order. The Romans were big on civic virtue, and civic virtue can't be enforced. It just happens to be a part of character. I'll give you an example of it, David. When Washington won the war, he resigned his commission and went back to Mount Vernon. And when George III, the King of England, heard this, he said, "No way, this never happens. The victor in a war usually sets himself up as a dictator or a permanent monarch. And he said, if George Washington has really resigned his commission and gone home to Mount Vernon, he's the greatest man in the world. Because it never happens. Napoleon doesn't do it. Lenin doesn't do it. Stalin doesn't do it. Castro didn't do it. This is rare. And so this was a small c norm that came straight out of Plutarch that George Washington felt compelled to embody. And Jefferson was always talking about going home to Monticello and gardening and so on. And he usually meant it. But even if he didn't mean it, he would have said it because it was expected. That was part of what's known as civic virtue. But most of our Bill of Rights comes from the other tradition, from the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon tradition dating back to 1215, the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta is the first document in a Teutonic language, in English, and this would be Middle English, early Middle English, that spelled out rights. Now, these were the rights of land barons against King John, but they nevertheless were such rights as habeas corpus, speedy trial, trial by jury of one's peers. And so that set of traditions really is an Anglo tradition, not a Roman tradition. So these two strains come together with the Founding Fathers. But if they had to choose, they would choose the Roman Republic as the model for what a successful republic would look like.
Next, I'd like to look to Richard Uphoff.
Thanks, Beth. And I'd like to extend my thanks to you, Clay, and to David, too, for creating this opportunity to interact with you. This is exciting. And while I've been a longtime listener of the show, I'm actually a very new member to the 1776 Club. So I'm very excited to say that I finally made the commitment to do that. My question, though, is around this idea of social media. And the more you hear lately about a right of privacy, or a right for people's privacy and a right of privacy. You know, the European Union recently wrote a set of regulations about privacy provisions in electronic communications. So I'm curious, Clay, if Jefferson could have comprehended the world we live in now of social media, like, do you think this idea of privacy would have been embedded in the Fourth Amendment, or would he have felt, appreciating social media, that it would have needed to sort of stand on its own in terms of a right?
So the right of privacy is never mentioned in the Constitution of the United States or in any of the amendments. There have been 27 amendments, the original 10, and then 17 since, two of which were essentially self-canceling and frivolous, the Prohibition Amendment and then the repeal of Prohibition. So we've really only amended the Constitution 15 times since 1791, which is not very often in a society like ours. I think that the founders expected that we would adjust our system more often than we do. But the right of privacy was sort of the whole business of the revolution, the right to be left alone. Don't tread on me. Don't tax me without representation. Don't get into my household or my life. The Fourth Amendment, you must have a warrant, and it has to say what you're looking for in a search of a person's home, and so on. So the privacy right is sort of floating around, but never articulated in its full sense in the Constitution or in the amendments. The Ninth Amendment is usually seen as the one that gets closest to articulating a privacy right, and it was used, for example, in Roe v. Wade. So we probably needed that. And if Jefferson were alive today, he would be all over this, because, as you know, people routinely give their privacy away to corporations and to a certain degree to government. And they don't always even know what they're doing. But if you go into a Costco and they say, do you want to sign up for our frequent Costco card? You're granting them rights to watch purchases and to share that information and to sell that information. We know that Facebook sells information. And there's always the fine print when you sign up for Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. But the fact is, most people don't know that they are freely giving away what the Founding Fathers would have gone to the wall to protect. I think we need to go along the European model of this and have explicit privacy guarantees. And we also need much greater civics education so that people, and particularly young people, are made aware. And we've all heard this, but the minute you put something on your device, you've lost it. There's no way that you can protect that. You're giving away an enormous amount of what would have been regarded as a sanctum of privacy until the technologies of the 20th century. So here's a way in which the 18th century Constitution doesn't have any real capacity to get at the technologies of our time. And I think we're going to come to regret it. Many people do already when their privacy is outed. And then you have hacking, where you suddenly target corporation will say, oh, sorry, folks, but our entire credit card file has been hacked by somebody. You'll want to change your credit card. So sorry this happened. It happens in government. It happens in business. So we're in for a real strain on the Bill of Rights in the 21st century. And I was talking to Joe Ellis, our great friend. I'm sure most of you know him from the Jefferson Hour. And I did an interview with him for the Constitution course last Friday. At the end of it, I said, where are we? And he said, the Enlightenment may have run its course. I was shocked when he said it, and I made him repeat it. I said, wait a minute. You, Joseph Ellis, one of the greatest American historians and historian of the early national period, are saying that the Enlightenment may have run its course? He said, yeah, maybe beginning with World War I, but it certainly has run its course now. That's a pretty shocking statement coming from Joseph Ellis, that the Enlightenment had a season. It was like a raspberry, or it was like a peach. It had a season, and it worked from 1700 until 1917 or 1974, or that it's strained and maybe expired.
You're listening to a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a Zoom town hall. We need to take a break, but we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We continue our Zoom town hall discussion about the Bill of Rights.
Don Jackson had a question. Don, would you mind unmuting? Don of Salida.
I recollect Salida being one of your favorite towns.
It is. I love Salida. Everyone lives off the grid or is planning to.
So my question is, obviously this isn't the first constitutional crisis that we've experienced in our history. How did we fare during the others?
Well, Jefferson gave us the first one, actually, in 1800, when he tied with Aaron Burr, and that threw the election into the House of Representatives, because we didn't yet have the 12th Amendment, which divides ticketing between the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates. That was a repair to the Constitution that Jefferson saw through during his first term. That amendment was ratified in 1804. So he lived through this, and it took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives before the Federalists finally gave up and let Jefferson become the third president of the United States. And I've been reading an awful lot about that. I've been writing, and I invite you to take a look at these articles. I write for Governing magazine, governing.com, and I'm their humanist. So I contextualize things that are happening by looking at history whenever possible. I just finished one today on bad, bungled presidential transitions. It'll be in Governing next week. But so Jefferson lived through this, and in researching it, I've read 3 or 4 books on the election of 1800 in the last month, and it turns out that Monroe, who was the governor of Virginia and Jefferson's protege, was actually planning to send Virginia militia troops into the District of Columbia to take back the presidency for Jefferson if the Federalists tried to hand it to somebody else. Think of this. So this happened in Pennsylvania too. So armies were being not organized, but were being planned to invade the District of Columbia to resolve by force, by military force, by civil war, this election, if necessary. The Federalists said, look, Burr got 73 electoral votes. Jefferson got 73 electoral votes. So we could give this to Burr. Maybe if we wait long enough, this will become the president pro tem of the Senate. Maybe we call a new election. Maybe we just Adams continues until such time as we can find a mechanism to resolve this. They were trying to prevent Jefferson from becoming the third president of the United States, and they undertook every legal means they had. And then they began to undertake some quasi-legal or illegal steps because they just weren't going to grant that this guy, Jefferson, who was regarded as a dangerous Frenchified philosopher who was too radical for this country, they wanted to prevent his installation. And so it got close to civil war. And if the Federalists had prevailed and they had named Burr to be the third president, we don't know what would have happened. Jefferson said, yeah, we got to be careful here. Let's not start threatening violence. but we don't know what his supporters would have done and what he would have acquiesced to. So think of it. This is 1800. We're only 12 years into our national constitutional experiment, and we already have the chance of civil disruption to the point of civil war. And then, of course, we see it again in 1861. 1876 was another really bungled election, which led to the Rutherford B. Hayes administration, and there were corrupt bargains. Same thing happened in 1824 with John Quincy Adams becoming president. It's been more irregular than you think. We got complacent in the second half of the 20th century because we thought there's a contest, somebody wins and somebody loses. The winner is gracious, the loser gives a wonderful concession speech. We move on with a very smooth transition. The Electoral College is just a rubber stamp. It has no actual meaning. Certainly the thing in January where the House and Senate certify the election is a pure rubber stamping. It has no substantive meaning whatsoever. The transitions will always be smooth. Every outgoing president will do what George Herbert Walker Bush did, which was say, what do you need? We'll give you access to absolutely everything you need. So there is a wonderful transfer of power. We all thought that was an eternal verity and standard of American life. And now we're seeing that this is small c Constitution, and there is nothing that requires the outgoing president to be gracious or to be cooperative. And even the 1963 law passed in the wake of John F. Kennedy's assassination that requires the GSA to provide monies and other protocols for the transfer of power, that doesn't have particularly strong enforcement capacities. And so we're seeing what can happen when somebody just refuses to play the small c constitutional game.
So maybe our Constitution is flexible, but not rigid, and sustains itself.
Well, I asked Ellis about this last week. At the end of this interview, I said, you've been at this for 44 years. You've written 14 books. You've won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. You're one of the top 10 historians in this country. You've earned your right to have a perspective on something like this. Was this a bump in the road? Was it a mid-level crisis, or did we come right to the edge of the abyss? And I said, don't answer right away. Take a deep breath and then answer. And there was about a 10-second silence, and he said, we came that close to the cliff. We came that close to the abyss. That's the guardrail barely held, and they wouldn't necessarily hold another time. That's a pretty chilling thing for a senior historian to say. It's one thing for a citizen to say, but somebody who has earned his stripes by writing 14 outstanding and award-winning books about the very nature of our constitutional system, you have to take that seriously. So we'll see. Beth.
I would look to Christopher Smith from what appears to be Monticello.
No way.
Very good.
Yes. Thank
wow,
you
and
very
it's
much.
a sunny day again there.
Yeah, it is. Every day is sunny in Monticello, right? So my question would be, you've mentioned before about Jefferson having this desire to once a generation tear up the Constitution and start over. Would that have included the Bill of Rights? And secondly, were there other founders who held that same belief in any way?
No, Jefferson was the only one, and Madison nearly tore his hair out over it because he thought, wow, really you want to reopen this can of worms? We're lucky to get the Constitution we got. No. And Madison also thought, you can't demarcate a generation, say on such and such a date, it's a new generation. Humans are born and they die organically, and so there's no easy way to do this. So Madison was pretty appalled by Jefferson's idea, but Jefferson had a point. And through this last year, I've become more and more enamored of Jefferson's viewpoint, because look at this. 80% of the American people think it's time for the Electoral College to be seriously transformed or eliminated in favor of a direct national popular presidential vote. Imagine trying to get there. The last amendment to the Constitution was 1992, and it was essentially a frivolous amendment. I can't imagine, can you, 2/3 of both houses approving this and 3/4 of the states ratifying this? That sounds like a statistical impossibility to me. So Jefferson knew this. You can't get at things from within because Congress isn't going to give itself term limits, and Congress isn't going to have a balanced budget amendment, and you can't expect people in power to relinquish their power. Maybe you get that once forever, like in Philadelphia in 1787, but you're not going to get it routinely. And so Jefferson thought, you've got to step out. And now you look at the Second Amendment with fresh eyes, and you look at the emoluments clause and the impeachment clause and the electoral college. This can only be done by an external review. It can't be done from within. And so that's why he wanted some kind of a sunset clause.
I would look to Jack Richardson in Virginia.
My question is, during this COVID time, is about the balance of rights such as freedom of speech and freedom to assemble and freedom of religion and other rights with public health measures that we've all encountered, and the ordering of those public health measures.
I think a lot about this because I have friends on both sides of this question. And here in North Dakota, as you might expect, the libertarian and liberty argument are very, very strong. I believe in human liberty, but here's the small c Constitution. We need enough civic virtue to know that wearing a mask, with very few exceptions, is a really smart public health measure on this side of a proven vaccine. And you can say that people have a right to avoid doing that, but your rights end where my rights begin and where my safety begins. And so I don't want to go into a store where people who have been exposed to COVID are not wearing masks and not practicing social distancing. But I also am not that eager to have a law requiring them to do it. And so you would hope that there was a widespread enlightenment that masks are important, that social distancing works, that this is what a responsible people does in the gravest public health crisis in our history, that people rise to the occasion and say, what's the right thing to do? I mean, don't you wish every American would say, what's the right thing to do? I'm not presuming there's only one right thing to do. It seems to me these are questions of what a society does when there's a catastrophe. We've seen it in wars. We've seen it in previous events during the Depression, even during the 2008 recession. You've seen a greater level of public trust and civic generosity than we're seeing right now. And so I'm a libertarian on this question. I don't want a law saying you must wear a mask. I want people to say, of course I'm going to wear a mask because I don't want to infect my neighbors. So I think that the small c Constitution is the one that's in the deepest trouble, actually, and that comes from the lack of civics education, which goes back to the question about how can the Jefferson Hour address a new generation of people who are not being trained in basic questions of civility and communitarianism and so on. It's a very serious problem, I think.
Adam Grant, you had a question in the chat. If you're able to unmute.
Yeah, absolutely, team. And thank you for putting this one together. Hey, Clay, my question was that kind of at the beginning of this discussion over who actually won the presidency, everyone started retreating towards the judiciary. Obviously we saw President Trump have three, pretty contentious Supreme Court nominations and confirmations during his term. And that kind of all goes back to judicial supremacy in Marbury versus Madison, which, is clearly related to Jefferson's time in office. Why is it that during the Jefferson administration, Marbury versus Madison was not either confirmed or repudiated with the constitutional amendment?
Great question. So Marbury v. Madison was a case in 1803 where one William Marbury, who had been nominated and confirmed by the Senate for a minor judicial position in the District of Columbia, did not get his commission because there were so many commissions, so many appointees in the last hours of the Adams administration that they literally didn't get the documents into the hands of everyone they were intended to get into. So that's how rushed it was. And when Madison comes in as Jefferson's Secretary of State, and there are these commissions that never got delivered, he asked Jefferson what to do. And Jefferson said, just throw them away. If they didn't get delivered, we're not going to honor them. We'll honor whatever got delivered, but we're not going to honor commissions that were never fulfilled. And so Marbury sued under something called a writ of mandamus, meaning show me the document, demanding that Madison, the Secretary of State, deliver him his commission. And Marshall didn't know how to decide this because he knew that if he instructed Jefferson to deliver the commission, Jefferson would say, sorry, not going to do it. And that would damage the power of the court. So in the end, he found a way around it. Marbury never got his job. But at the end of this decision, this incredibly important decision, Marbury said that the Supreme Court was the final arbiter of what is constitutional, that the Supreme Court will decide whether a law harmonizes with the Constitution or whether it doesn't. That was the creation of judicial review for our system. The founding fathers in Philadelphia did not put judicial review in the Constitution in Article 3. It wasn't invented by Marshall because the idea existed, but he installed it in this decision. And here's what's so great about that, and here's the answer to your question. Marbury didn't get his commission. The Jefferson administration might have been slightly embarrassed, but they weren't backed into any corner. Marshall didn't have the court make a pronouncement that it couldn't enforce. So it kind of stayed quiet under the radar because Jefferson and Madison could say, that guy didn't get his commission. That's all we were really hoping for. They didn't notice the little seed that Marshall had planted in that decision, that the Supreme Court would be the final arbiter of what is and what is not constitutional. And the amazing thing, now we expect this all the time. We wait every spring for the court to decide questions of everything. That's very recent. That was the first use of judicial review, 1803. The second use of judicial review didn't come until 1857. 54 years later, the Dred Scott decision. That was only the second time in American jurisprudence that the Supreme Court struck down a provision of a law duly passed by the Congress of the United States and signed into law by the president. So 1803 and not again until 1857. Well, now we see it dozens of times per year and hundreds of times per decade. But back then, it was a quiet little seed that Marshall planted, and Jefferson, who was a genius and a very shrewd political discerner, didn't see what was coming. If he had seen it, he might have tried to do something about it. But remember, after 1803, Jefferson's administration impeached 2 justices of the courts. They impeached John Pickering of New Hampshire, and he was successfully convicted by the Senate of the United States. But he was insane, and his family actually asked the Jefferson administration to get rid of him for his own benefit. And so that one doesn't really count. But it was a successful impeachment, not of a Supreme Court justice, but of a circuit judge. And then in 1805, Jefferson went after Samuel Chase, a Supreme Court justice, and that one failed. Chase was acquitted by the United States Senate. If Jefferson had been successful in impeaching Samuel Chase, he probably would have gone after John Marshall too. And one of the great moments where the guardrails held was when the Senate of the United States refused to convict Samuel Chase, who wasn't a bad guy. He was just a kind of a angry Federalist. And so Jefferson was chastened in his attempts to emasculate, to castrate the Supreme Court of the United States. That's a key moment in our history. And let me just say as we close, I'll have a few more words to say, but let me just say this. When the history of this last year is written, the judiciary is going to be the hero. That and the people in states like Georgia, the certifiers, the election officials, the people in those states that defended their actions against what has to have been almost colossal pressure. Those people in Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania stood up and took the heat and did the right thing when they could easily have succumbed, as our state attorney general did here. They're going to be the heroes of this, and so is the Supreme Court. When the case got to the Supreme Court, when that case came to the Supreme Court, they slapped it down 9-0. And that said, the judiciary is going to be the guardrail. I want to thank David Swenson, of course, Pat Brodowski, our dear, dear, dear friend from Monticello. We wish you well, and I know we'll continue to see you, but we will miss you when we come to the gardens at Monticello and find some mere gardener there instead of a world-class person like yourself and Beth, who's going to be an important figure in the future of the Jefferson Hour. To all of you, God bless you. Have a great holiday, and thank you for giving us some of your time here tonight.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.